called the reader response theory, right? Now, even some people who belong to the new critic group, even some people, and I mean Richards, for instance, you can divorce everything from the text. You can divorce the author. If I give you a text that does not have a cover and does not have the name, you can divorce the author perhaps. If I give you a text without a cover or the author and the name of the author, you could also perhaps not focus on anything that's outside the text, because you'll not know the time that the text was written in. But how will you divorce the reader from the text, right? Anything and everything that a text gives you or is felt in a text is through a reader only, right? So while I understand intentional fallacy, that don't focus on the intention of the author, it's very difficult to come around affective fallacy, right? The term that I told you about, the term that was introduced by Wimsatt and Beardsley, we saw it in New Criticism, right? So anything and everything you can wrap your head around. You can understand not focusing on the author, not the history, or not the events that are happening, and everything and everything. But how do you not understand and focus on the reader? Because everything the text is through the reader. And here I would first like to talk about Roland Barthes' text called The Death of the Author, right? So his text is, he's written the text called The Death of the Author, and where he talks of the fact that an author dies the moment the reader is born, right? So if I tell you about, say, I give you a text called suppose I give you R.K. Narayan's The Man-Eater of Malgudi, right? And now, so you all of us know that Malgudi is a fictional town that R.K. Narayan has created, right? So if I give you a Man-Eater of Malgudi and I tell you to read that text, and you figure and you come across a description of the place that he's created. So a description of the place, for instance, talks of a certain set of mountains that are there, and then if there is a river flowing by, right? Or if there is, for instance, you say there are a couple of huts and the land is very muddy, or there's always a storm, right? So as I'm saying these things and as you're listening it, you've already created an image in your mind, right? You've created an image in your mind. And what are the odds that the image that R.K. Narayan, or for instance here I gave you, was exactly the same as the author had thought in my head? It can't be similar. It is never similar, right? So what it does, while I have created a landscape, while I have talked of mountains and of rivers and of huts, you have created them also, right? You as a reader have also contributed in creation of that mountain and that river and those huts, because you've taken my imagination and you've gone further with it, right? You've gone further in any direction that you wanted to and any direction that you can take, right? So a reader is only born after the author dies, right? So here, before I begin talking to you about the people and the important concepts that they've given, and let's understand how do you implement reader response as a theory in criticism, right? How do you do a reader response theory criticism of a text? How do you, right? Now there are various ways. There can be one where you look at various interpretations, right? And for this I always go back to the Waiting for Godot example. Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. So the first time Samuel Beckett had staged Waiting for Godot, and this is for people who were regularly visiting theatre, so all the theatre going population, they did not understand it, they did not appreciate it. The play bombed, right? But the play really worked well when it was shown to a set of prisoners. Okay, so there are various groups in various circumstances in life, having various experiences, having various aspects of reading, having various inclinations and stereotypes associated with reading or watching a play for instance, which influences your interpretation, right? and your interpretation varies. So a reader response criticism could one be looking at various interpretations, right? So one, it could be looking at various interpretations. Now what else could it be? Every author creates a text for an ideal reader, or as Wolfgang Isser would call it, an implied reader. Right? So I've also given you the fact that Wolfgang Isser has given the term ideal reader and an implied reader. So what is an ideal reader? Every time anybody or any author writes a text, it is written with keeping a certain kind of audience in mind. And the author feels at any time anytime the text comes out and anytime the reader reads a text, it's only the ideal reader who's going to read it as I want my reader to read it. So for instance, Eliot's Wasteland. Right? All of us know it has a lot of allusions, there's a lot of allegories that are loaded with allegories. So for instance, if there is a mention of Paradise Lost, and if there is a mention of Pilgrim's Progress, and there are various other mentions, as a literature student, as somebody who teaches literature, because I have the background, right? Now I could have read Paradise Lost, I could have read Pilgrim's Progress, but there are various other texts also. And I as a reader could never fill the mold that the author is trying to create for me as the ideal or the implied reader, because I will always either lag in whatever the expectations of the author is, or sometimes even go beyond the expectations of the author, right? If the author expects me to be a 10, I could be an 8 or I could be a 12, right? But I could never be the exact 10. So while every author writes with keeping the ideal reader in mind, there is in fact no ideal reader, right? So it's a term given by Wolfgang Isser. Now you can then look at what an ideal reader reading would be, right? Now some of you could say that how do you know what an ideal reader reading could be, right? So for instance, if you look at the text and you see there is Paradise Lost, you would make sense of it, right? Somebody perhaps who's read Paradise Lost would understand this better. Or if it's a love poem that you come across and it's a poem of heartbreak, you'd immediately say that somebody who's recently had a heartbreak would associate to the poem better, right? So that is going to be your interpretation of the text through an ideal reader, that you're critiquing the poem and you say, but had it been read by somebody who's recently had a heartbreak, the effect could have been different, because there could have been an association of anxiety and sorrow. Then there could also be for you to understand that if as a reader, when you pick up text, you have certain expectations, right? And this Robert Joss calls horizon of expectations. What are these horizon of expectations? These are the expectations that anybody who picks a text has. So any reader who picks a text has certain expectations. And if the author goes beyond those expectations, the author becomes successful in your eyes, right? The reading becomes successful and the task of the author is accomplished, and the task of you yourself as a reader is also accomplished, right? Then there are various other terms, like there is interpretive communities. Interpretive communities. I'll try and clear this out a little bit. So there is Interpretive Communities by Stanley Fish. Now what are interpretive communities? I'll again go back to the Hamlet example. So Hamlet is the pertinent question in Hamlet again is, why was the action delayed? So there are interpretations which focus on the Oedipus angle, and says that perhaps because there was a thing between Hamlet and Gertrude, and so the action was delayed because it was a persistent confusion in the mind of Hamlet. Now, what does this reading do? Now, this reading of delayed action comes from a shared reading community that has, say, a background in literature, or has, say, read a lot of Shakespeare, has a background in psychoanalytic reading, has an understanding of psychoanalytic theory, right? So this interpretive community, which is a community of, say, literature graduates, have a shared reading value. They have a shared reading value, they have strategies, they have assumptions. And what does that do? It polices out outlandish readings, right? So it polices out all the outlandish readings that could exist of Hamlet. So if there is an interpretation which says the action was delayed because Hamlet is lazy, the interpretive community will try and police that interpretation and would tell you that no, this is perhaps not the reason, right? Right, so these are some of the important terms that are associated with reader response theory, and these are the important people, right? So now moving on to the next one, which is New Historicism, right? So now New Historicism is 1980, so you'll see that it's after all these ones that I've mentioned already. And it's also after your structuralism and deconstructionist theory, which we are going to discuss in later classes, right? So New Historicism is almost like a response to all these theories that focus on language a lot. So for instance, New Criticism, Formalism, Structuralism, where the focus is on words and focus is on the form, and the focus is on the kind of words that are used. And so in that case, what we do is what did the New Historics do? The New Historics said that no, the text cannot be seen devoid of history. A text can never be seen devoid of history. So even if you're reading a text where you don't know the author, you don't know the era, but still, so if you're reading, say, The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope, and you know nothing about the author, you know nothing about the time that the text is written in, just the mention about the carpets or the china ware would indicate something about colonization, right? And just the times that the text is written in, there are a lot of instances that the text picks up only because it's set in a certain amount of time. And so history itself is not outside the text. History is very much inside of it only, right? History is very much inside the text only, and that is what the New Historics are talking of. And this is how they're different from old historics also. History, they say, is inside the text. So like what the new critics say, or what the formalists say about looking at the text from the inside, the history is inside, and you must look at the history also, because without history, your understanding of the text is incomplete. Then how are these people different from the old historics? Now what did the old historics do? They focused only on the dominant history, right? What did the new historics do? They focus on alternate history, right? The term itself for the first time was introduced by the work of Stephen Greenblatt in a journal called Representation. Stephen Greenblatt has also written a very famous text called The Renaissance Self-Fashioning, right? Where he says that according to the dominant ideology, the people have a tendency to self-fashion themselves, right? People have a tendency to change themselves. People have a tendency to reform themselves according to the dominant ideology that exists. And why is that? Why are people improvised? Improvisation is also another term that he uses. Who? Greenblatt, right? So improvisation is another term that he uses. He says people are improvised to fit into the dominant ideology. And then what is your job as a new critic? To look at the alternate, right? So for instance, the idea that the Romantic era will only have people who are going to talk about emotions, right? Or the Augustan period will only have people who believe in reason, right? Don't you think these are very extreme ideas to think that an entire population of people within 10 years would shift from reason to emotions, whatever be the context? I understand the shift in some, but to assume that all authors of the age within a span of 10 years will stop writing about reason and completely start writing about emotions, or all people in the Renaissance have a desire as men to go beyond the realms that are known, is that a possibility, right? So I'll give you a relevant example. Even people today who are not that fond of social media, right? Because of the pressures that the world is exerting on you, that your country is exerting on you, that your friends are exerting on you, that your family is exerting on you, you would want to get on the bandwagon of social media, right? You would want to. You would be a very recluse person. You would say, if people are posting everything about their clothes and food and life and love life and everything else, reading what they're reading, if people are posting everything and you're a recluse, you would perhaps only post the book that you're reading, but you would still do that, right? So what has been done? You, despite not wanting to, you've been taken up by the dominant ideology, right? So what is the idea that the new historics want to focus on? They want to focus on alternate histories, right? The focus they want is to be on alternate histories. Okay, now why Foucault is important here? So Foucault's written a lot of texts. He's written History of Sexuality, he's written Madness and Civilization, he's written Discipline and Punish. And what are all these texts talking of? They're talking of variation in history, right? So don't take the dominant as the only historical possibility. Go beyond that. Look in history, find alternates from civilizations that you don't belong to, and cultures that you don't belong to, and eras that you don't belong to, and find possible alternate histories that could perhaps be better in the dominant order that you've accepted as the only viable option, right? So Foucault is important. Even Bakhtin is very important here. So while not really associated with new historicism, Bakhtin's idea of heteroglossia. What is heteroglossia? Heteroglossia is multiplicity of voices in a text. So because there are multiple voices in a text, and there is obviously the essential dominant voice, but there are also multiple alternate voices. And it's important for us as readers or viewers of the play or the text to know those voices. Even if your alternate voice does not subvert the dominant, the alternate voice is important, right? These are some basic ideas about new historicism. These are the four theories that we are going to discuss today.